So hello, Mick Stott and Vicky. How are you both doing?
We're very well, Karen.
We've been busy.
And it's
Have
been a
you?
long time since we've seen you physically.
Yeah, I know.
You know, it
I
being in
know,
your person, it's been a long time.
And you're
I
looking
know.
bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, might I
I
say.
am very, very, very bushy, frizzy kizzy, I'm called these days. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I'm in the tropics of the humid and in Costa Rica, taking time out and looking after myself, as we tell people, and getting some vitamin D. Always try and get away in January because it's
Yeah.
quite depressing in Europe, isn't it? Or in the UK, it's, gloomy. Although the other day I was talking to somebody there, the skies were blue, it was gorgeous, it was fresh, lovely winter. Here it was overcast and raining, but warm. It's always warm. But yeah, so it's lovely to have you
Well,
back on my channel, Wise Women Weekdays. Thank you for joining me. And anybody watching this, please give us a thumbs up and comments and any, let us know what you think about these chats that we're doing. And today we're talking about the shadow self, I think, are we
mm,
not? Because yeah, it's really important. And before I pass it over to you, I would just say it's interesting. I was watching a video about from William Keat this
oh yeah,
morning,
yeah.
and he's a very wise man. He's a very wise
Mm,
man, and he was talking indirectly about the shadow self, really, which is kind of we've got to sort ourselves out first, especially in the freedom movement, because here we're
Mm.
we're pointing fingers at they've done this and they've done that, and we're accusing them, but there's no like jury of 12. We're just assuming, which is as bad as what they're doing, and therefore it's so important that we do the work on ourselves, because that's where it's at. Once we change ourselves, then maybe that knock-on effect, the world will change as well. So what do you think? What is a shadow self?
Well, just using what you've just talked about there, people making accusations, um, and what Mick was talking about earlier with regards to measuring a behaviour and opinion. And of course, we are humans, right? I describe it as we're spirits having a human experience. And when a human comes in, unless we measure something behaviorally, we are in an opinion. And that opinion can be distorted based on where we've been in our life and
yeah.
based on the emotions that we hold. And so, the jury of 12 is a really important thing, isn't it? But you could have 12 different opinions. So I always use a very simple analogy. If I go to make a cup of tea, the behavior is I'm making a cup of tea. Now, if we were to ask 10 different people why I made a cup of tea, and I know it's a very simple example, but nonetheless, it delivers the same message. If we were to ask many people, why did I make a cup of tea? Somebody might say, well, she was making it for somebody else. Somebody else might say, well, she was thirsty. Someone might say, well, she's bored. Someone might say, well, she was escaping. There could be a whole number of reasons as to why I made a cup of tea. The behavior is I made a cup of tea. The confusion comes as to the reason why. Now, of course, unless you ask me, why did I make a cup of tea, you'll never know the truth. And equally, if you ask me, why did I make a cup of tea, and you've never met me before, you have no idea whether I'm telling the truth or not. That's an assumption, right? Unless, of course, you have a history with me where you've been able to measure how honest I am and therefore whether I am telling the truth. So there's many complexities that have to be considered when you look at behavior. And of course, we can translate that behavior to anything in life that a human being does or anything that's going on in the world. We can see the behaviors and we can all go, getting cross purposes with regards to the why, because it's the why where we'll disagree, unless, of course, we get the facts.
It's worth remembering that when we run a coach's program, or if I do a coach program, a trainer's program, or a high performance program, the first thing I teach someone to do is to calibrate. What does calibrate mean? It means measure. And what we do is we measure. So I can physically see when someone's made a cup of tea. That then becomes a fact. Now, as Vicky said, any opinion that we have in that moment is complete imagination until we've asked the person why they made it, because we couldn't possibly know that. So we're therefore measuring someone else's world through our own experience. And of course, the shadow, it is all about the bits of ourself that we don't know and that we've yet to find out. So the shadow essentially is that. Carl Jung's version of the shadow is you marry your unconscious, you project it onto others outwardly. And the shadows are the parts of our unconscious that we actively avoid and project onto others, because to believe them about ourselves would possibly be too painful. And so behavioral measurement is really quite important, because if I have a real reaction to something and I start to point the finger at somebody else, one of the things that we're taught in life is for every finger that you point at other people, there are 3 fingers pointing back at yourself. And the reason that statement resonates on a level is because if I actively accuse people of different things, and I'm in my opinions, I'm in my imagination. And so the whole purpose of teaching someone to calibrate, to measure physiological and behavioral responses is so that you stop hallucinating. Because with some of the practices we do on the coaching program, we invite people to take a look at a video, and it shows a game of basketball going on, and we ask them to note how many times the ball is bounced and how many times it's caught or passed. Now, while they're busy looking at that, what happens is a gorilla walks through the screen, beats its chest, and walks out. Nobody sees the gorilla, because our mind is a limited processor. So, and nobody is beyond that, by the way, because out of all of the experience that we're having, we're only actually observing the bits that are important and relevant to us. So the moment we start to get a reaction, or the moment we start to gain some sort of internal reaction to something, what we've got to remember is at that point, our vision is closing down and our perspective completely shuts down. So the moment you're fed up about something, be very, very careful that all the things that you're saying about it aren't about yourself, and they're not parts of you that are unresolved. There was a lovely bit of work called Judge Your Neighbor. And it was a lady called, I think it was Katie, and what she did was she said, okay, write everything that you dislike about your neighbor. Then what she got people to realize was the person they were describing were elements of themselves that they could not embrace or like, because we all have this ideal self. We don't see who we are to other people. And this ideal self, the moment somebody starts to rock that element of our ideal self and get us in touch with our real self, our actual self, that can be quite a painful journey. And the gap between your ideal self and your actual self, the bigger the gap, the bigger the shock. So if I start to say somebody's an awkward sod, I've got to ask myself in me, when have I been awkward? Because this is the filter that I'm now observing a behavior through. And if I'm not measuring it, I'm projecting it. And so the first question we say to anyone, if anyone accused me of something, the first question I would say is, how did I create that? That's the first question I'd ask myself. People don't do that. Because when you're blaming, you're not owning.
And of course, when you get into the blaming world, which we've all done to varying degrees, some greater than others, some blame others, some blame self, some have a mixture of the two. But it's actually easier to blame somebody else for something than it is to actually take ownership and say, okay, how did I contribute to that? Because every relationship, there's 2 parts to it. And sometimes when you start to get in touch with elements of yourself, and I can speak from personal experience on this, and it's not been very elegant, has it, Mick? When I found parts of myself that I didn't want to embrace, I knew it was a truth if I got angry, because, then I'm getting angry about something, and so therefore the truth hurts, right? But the more we dig into our shadow self, and the more that we change ourselves, when you start to touch your blind spot, what we're holding in the unconscious that we're not aware of, that becomes a more elegant journey. Because as you take away these layers of life, and some people talk about trauma, and some people wouldn't connect to the word trauma because they think it's this big thing, right? But as human beings, we go on a journey, and we all experience different life experiences. And some of those layers of life that are natural part of the journey, like losing people or going through divorce or going through adoption or whatever the journey happens to be, with that comes a pain sometimes. With that comes emotions that aren't serving to us. And of course, the worst person that you could put in charge of your anti-bullying policy in your workplace is a person who's been bullied. Because what happens is, and that's speaking of a person who did experience extreme bullying as a child, what happens with our focus, because of any negative emotion that comes in, does this to our vision. It focuses us and we can become hypervigilant. So for the veterans that we work with, for example, you know, who've been in the arena with the IRA or with the Taliban or wherever they've been, you'll often find that when they go into a pub, they will sit with their back to the corner because they now have become hypervigilant around everything that is going on around them, and they're in their imagination. They're imagining dangers that never exist. And that's driven by those lower frequency energies, such as anger, fear, guilt, hurt, and anxiety. But when we start to change those feelings around the areas of life that we accumulate, maybe abandonment, rejection, loss, divorce, betrayal, any word that holds neurology, what happens is our mindset starts to get broader. We start to become more aware. We kind of go from the ground, we're in the weeds of our experience, to being almost the eagle, where we can have a greater perspective and we can actually start to measure something and see, you know, our imagination, separate our imagination from a physical behavior.
And it's all based on where you've been. So the two things that will influence your experience right now is where you've been and what you expect. So expectations in the past will have the biggest impact on where you are right now. You know, when Carl Jung said you marry your unconscious and you project it outwardly, what he also said was, you don't see the world the way the world is, you see the world the way you are on the inside. Now, so just imagine you've had nothing but abusive type relationships. Until you change your emotional connection to those relationships, there's a good chance that's all you're ever going to attract. And equally, there's a good chance that even if someone nice came along, you wouldn't even recognize them. And you certainly wouldn't embrace it because that's not what you're used to. Some people get so used to creating fires in their life that if these now start to disappear, they'll create a fire just to give them a sense of familiarity. And of course, this is one of the challenges when we don't understand our own projections. And of course, the calibration of behavior is the first step in keeping yourself sane. But you know, it's got to be followed by one fundamental thing, and that's honesty. So one of the first,
and integrity. So can I, if I can just interject here, that all makes total sense, and there's lots I'd love to add to it, but it's great to hear, you know, hear what you have to say between the pair of you. Can this be changed, or is this, do you think, just a mental thing, a spiritual thing, or is it an energetic thing? So like you're saying, you know, we're going to keep getting lessons until we learn the lessons, and then we move on and we don't attract the same partner. Somebody that has come through an abusive relationship might, you know, leave that relationship, but the next relationship might be abusive. Do you think that's an energy thing? If we work on it energetically, we can sort it, or is it something we ourselves have to take? We physically have to take.
From my perspective, it's
take
all
responsibility for.
But it impacts on the spiritual. It's the spiritual journey.
Frequency, it's energy, vibration.
All those emotions hold an energy and a frequency.
And a vibration.
They say, don't they, that if you put 1,000 people in the room, it takes less than 5 minutes for all of those who've been abused to find each other. Because it's an unconscious, energetic.
So there's that connection.
Yeah.
So therefore, but therefore, going back to my question, sorry, I think the line just went. Oh, excuse me. So, can therefore, if it's energy, and I agree, it's, you know, working at the same frequency, can somebody else sort out my shadow work, for instance? Can somebody else, if I just lay there and they do all this, you know, wonderful energy work, then I'm sorted? Or do we have to make that decision and take responsibility and be conscious of it? Do we have to do the work ourselves?
You can't change what you don't acknowledge, Karen. So if you don't acknowledge something on the inside, then it's very difficult for you to get outside of your own frame. So someone else can help raise the awareness in you. I mean, I created something for PTSD, and I wasn't aware that I'd even experienced PTSD. So I had to have a journey, and mainly with Victoria, that allowed Victoria to hear my frame, get me to acknowledge some elements of my shadow. Because remember, it's something that you're not aware of, and nor is anyone else. The way the shadow is exposed in our world is through semantic questions and directed questions for triggers, for driving emotions. And of course, that becomes then a specialist skill in some ways. Yeah. But essentially, and also your mind works in layers. So for some people that are very, very sentient, for instance, even getting in touch with something can feel exceptionally difficult to embrace. And when an energy grabs hold of you, and you know, the emotions are the gateway to your spirit. They're certainly the gateway to your Akashic records for anyone that is spirit. Because when somebody says to me, I'm meditating, and I'm a great calibrator, I can measure a behavior, I can sort of go, well, you're in your head. And the only thing that would stop you from getting into your deeper self is anything emotional that's getting in the way of that frequency, that energy, or that vibration. They all come from emotion.
And of course, people talk about positive thinking and affirmations. Yeah. At the end of the day, whatever our internal dialogue speaks to us, that is our frequency. Yeah. We can talk ourselves positive as much as we like. Mm-hmm. We can push our thoughts aside and push them down, but our thoughts are a truth. Everything we think drives everything we feel and everything that we do at the unconscious level. And of course, you know, a behavior is driven 95% from the unconscious. And so some people who want to change a behavior or a pattern, they find it really hard. Yeah. And they work on it for a little while, and then it becomes tiring and stressful, and they can't sustain it. And the reason for that is the very core components that drive our attitude, whatever our attitude is in various different areas of our life, whether it be in a relationship, whether it be at work, whether it be in a hobby, whether it be in a social environment, wherever we take our attitude and our mindset, that will show us who we are in those places. And the things that drive that are the core components within our unconscious. So unless you change your negative emotions, your limiting beliefs, your internal conflicts, which are part-time problems. Part of me loves him, part of me hates him. Part of me wants to stay, part of me wants to leave. Part of me believes I can heal, part of me doesn't. Those internal conflicts will drain energy more than anything. And the barriers that we put up. So for example, if we take the word rejection, if people have experienced rejection in their life, they may not even realize that before they go into a relationship, because of the fear of rejection, they start to self-sabotage on it and then wonder why they self-sabotage. So all of these have to be resolved. When people say, well, go into meditation, there's no change mechanism in meditation. No. It might make you feel nice.
And it's easy to hide.
You might get some messages within that. Yeah. But how do you know you have changed? The only way that you know you have comprehensively changed is to re-immerse yourself into a previously challenging situation and measure it through either the triggers that have disappeared, which are the obvious ones. I'm no longer angry. Or I'm still angry, but actually I come down much quicker than I would have done previously. And through the things that we might start to do, and through the things that we stop doing, because it's all an unconscious thing. And of course, anybody that says to me they know themselves, I would say, no, you don't. Nobody knows themselves.
No, not a chance.
Because there is so much in your unconscious that you won't even realize that is there.
Yep.
And therefore, you know, getting into that and starting to expose it, energy is very, very powerful, you know, and actually, you know, you can't deal with it all in one go, because I think it would actually make you unwell. Yeah. Because energy is so powerful.
So powerful.
It is so powerful.
I mean, we've seen people completely laid out just from running a conflict. And if you think about it, you know, we store on average, according to Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, about 80 gigabytes of data a day in our nervous system. Now, that's an awful lot of neurology. And words have neurology connected to them. And of course, we are these layers. So coming out of denial has to be safe and appropriate. If you look at somebody that has a Kundalini awakening, what we're learning with Kundalini, for instance, is that you have an awakening that you can't manage because of all the stuff you've accumulated, but this energy has to find its way out. And during that process, if you can change the stuff that's getting in the way at the level of the chakra systems, then that journey is going to be much easier than someone that has no change mechanism.
No.
Because I can't think of anything worse than to have some of the energies that we've had, that we've experienced, and I wouldn't say we're any different to the average person. Some people have had worse journeys than we have. So how they manage with that energy is unbelievable, really. We're luckily we have spectrum. So in reality, anything that pops up gets changed. Because if you don't change it now, in the arena that we are in, and if you're very clever, what you do is anyone you meet or any situation you meet, you use that as a way of finding out where you are on your own journey. So every situation becomes a mirror for your blind spot, for the things that you hold on the inside that you might not be aware of. And it doesn't matter whether it's good, bad, or ugly. It's how you deal with it, move on from it, as opposed to define yourself by it. So when someone's going around saying, well, X, Y, and Z has happened to me, and they can't let this go even after 30 years, that's not the kind of person that's going to evolve that quickly, because they're still stuck in an old story, an old routine. And part of this journey, if you're clever, is that every person you meet then becomes part of a metaphor that you're already writing for yourself. So whether it's good, whether it's bad, whether it's ugly, whether it's a war situation, whether it's a hospital situation, a prison situation, they're all parts of your story. And if you then pay attention to the stories that people tell you about, or the conversations that you're holding, they'll have a habit of telling you either where you're going, what you've resolved, or where you've been. And clients do that for coaches, and it's an unmistakable experience. I remember my first female client that I had, and I was struggling with my relationship with my girlfriend, a lovely lady called Alison, and because she said it was like living with a robot. And of course, I was still serving then, so I can totally get my head around that, because I was about as evolved as a pot leg. And of course, I then had this lovely lady, an older lady, and she said, well, I've never had a male therapist before. And I said, well, I've never really had a female client. I said, I'll tell you what, we'll have a little chat, and if it works, I'm happy to work with you. And if it doesn't, then we'll say cheerio to each other. Anyway, we sat down, and Alison had accused me of being a robot for about 2 years. And I'm sat with a lovely lady called Phyllis, and she said to me, well, I'm with a man at the moment, and he's just like a robot. And what she gave me over the next hour was the repertoire of what I was doing. Now, of course, she wasn't doing that. It's just that her story was totally resonating with mine. And of course, this is known as transference. So equally, this is why when people go for counselling and they speak to a counsellor, this is why counsellors end up getting worn out if they have no change mechanism, because they're constantly sharing their own trauma. So it's almost like it takes one to spot one. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And of course, if we're not in the world of judgment, if we're in the world of that's just interesting information, that's an indication that we are evolving. Because when you can get to a point where you can own every element of the bits you don't want to believe about yourself, and you can use them to evolve, then you're becoming powerful. Mm. But if I'm in the business of punishing people all the time, and wanting to see people hung and strung up, and wanting the punitive element of it, surely I've got to ask myself what drives that behaviour. And I can guarantee at some point that's what I will have experienced.
It never comes from happiness either.
No, and the thing is, we've learned through our experience, whether you believe it or not. If you were a Buddhist, you would also be contemplating the lives that you've had before you came into this one. And that would give you a greater wisdom. It would also give you a greater understanding of some of the experiences that we see when we start to see people that say, I don't even know why I do this. I mean, how can you get somebody that can play a piano at 4 and 5 years of age absolutely fluently, as if they've been playing it for 30, 40, 50 years? Well, I have my own take on that. I was a fencer in the British Army, and I rarely had to train. I could put a sabre in my hand and go and win the Army Championships with a couple of weeks preparation. And yet there were people training all year round to do that. Now, if I was to tap into my repertoire of past lives, I've mainly been a combatant. So combat has always been natural to me. I've never been an anxious person. anxiety has never come into my mind. Out of all the emotions that I've resolved, anxiety has never really featured at all. And I think that's down to a level of conditioning. I was a martial artist at the age of 16, the North of England karate champion, and I was a fighter by nature. And that's actually taken a bit of time to come to terms with, because when I used to bump into bailiffs or anything like that, I have to switch my combat off. I never have to switch it on. And I'm sort of going, well, where does that come from? Because I'm ready to fight. And I could easily use something. Does that make sense? So ultimately, this is about understanding yourself, isn't it? And not being stuck in this human frame.
And of course, you said, can anyone change you? We have to be the change that we want to see.
Yeah.
If we want to have a more peaceful world, we have to become more peaceful on the inside.
You go inside.
Go inside.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But you've got to be prepared, because I've heard lots of people, Karen, say, oh, you've got to address your shadow. And I say, how do you do that then? It's a matter of interest. And they don't have a clue how they do it. And how did you do it then as a matter of interest? And they can't tell you.
Because there's no mechanism for it, really.
So they understand it unconsciously. And by the way, we're not judging anyone, and we're not sort of saying, oh, well, you should know better, because you don't know what you don't know until you find out. And, the reason that Spectrum has made such an impact in the arena of trauma is that it was designed for that purpose. It was designed to address the gateway to your spirit, which is your emotion.
And I think, I can only speak from my journey, having had 2 marriages that weren't, let's say, healthy relationships. The second one of which I never realized wasn't a healthy relationship until the very end. And then I really got to see who he was. And I also got to see who I was. And there was a double pronged.
It's always a two-way journey.
There was a double pronged journey there, because I had to come out of denial about him. But I would say the hardest bit was coming out of denial of who I had become as well. That was equally as hard, because I created him. How did I create him? Through no boundaries, through giving permissions, through disrespecting myself, through all of those things. Now, I can't blame anyone else if I've not said, actually, that's not acceptable. Because if we never say that's not acceptable, if you let children just run riot and never teach them what's acceptable and what's not, how do they ever know? So unless we teach them, I say we're the macrocosm within the microcosm, and our relationship with our governments are the same. We only get permission, we only get what we've given permission to. And of course, we've given over the years and years and years permission to an awful lot. And so when you think about the spiritual age that we are coming into now, and we've transitioned, we were in a transition from Piscean age and the Aquarian age, and we are now cleanly in the golden age of Aquarius, which is the 5th dimension, going into heart and compassion. And that's about now us regaining our own balance of internal power and putting in our boundaries respectfully, kindly, never with any punishment, and learning to now readdress those energies that we hold within ourselves, because the world's become too masculine. And I mean masculine at the level of energy, not at the level of gender. I hear so many women going into the corporate world who have to be more masculine because that's the energy they're dealing with.
Nothing more unattractive.
So within each of us, we all have that twin flame of masculine and feminine energy, which needs redressing within each one of us.
Well, it does, because if you actually take it into an extreme environment, the male-female argument, you can see it for what it is. Because with some of the, so for instance, I'm just preparing to do a 56 miler in June and a marathon in May. And when I went through the Army Physical Training Corps, I took Dame Kelly Holmes through her PT2. So she was one of the top girls on her course. If I'd have pitched her against the average guy on that course, she wouldn't have held a candle to him. And she's one of the top girls at her event. So when you enter an extreme environment, you actually see the complete difference between male and female for all of the right reasons. Because equally, there are some things that the girls can do that we just can't touch. You know, I wouldn't run a trauma program without having feminine energy in that, because anything that becomes too lopsided, too masculine, it becomes completely unruly. You know, Karen.
And sorry, an interject. And equally, anything that becomes too feminine becomes too feeble.
Feeble, absolutely. And of course, I was responsible for discipline. And I always insisted that out of a program of 40 men, there was always one girl on it. And you would be amazed that if there's just one girl on that within that group of 40 men, how the men would behave. You have 40 men on their own, and it was a nightmare. Just one girl, the power of the feminine. So, you know, we learned some lessons very young in life, I would imagine. I knew where I was very early in life because I've got 8 sisters. So I knew where the power curve was very quickly.
8 sisters, goodness,
Yeah.
that's a lot of sisters.
Because if you got cheeky, they overpowered you with numbers, you see.
And he also learned, Karen, that he had to just go, oh, and they're like, would you like a cup of tea?
Back to the cup of tea.
Yeah.
It's interesting also because you've mentioned a couple of things, and like politicians or whatever, and I think it's the same thing is to do with labels, isn't it? We label people, whether it's a doctor, a politician, a barrister, a lawyer, somebody that serves you coffee, that barrister as well, and they come with like prejudgment from ourselves. But if you take the uniform off, you've just got that naked human being, which is you know, takes us back to the very basics as well.
It's essential that you take the uniform off them. I've never put myself out there as anything special, you know, and I'm sure there's some people out there that think I'm not special, and I'm okay with that, because what they think about me that is not measured is their own shit. They just don't know it yet. And it's also not my job to tell them either, because equally, it's not my job to say to somebody, you should change. My job is my journey, my path, and whoever I meet along that path, I will do my utmost, one, to be perfectly honest with them, and, you know, stand on me if I haven't been honest, and secondly, to treat them the way that I want to be treated myself. And of course, you know, we're all at some point in our lives in denial of who we are, and our truth evolves as we evolve. You know, I believed, for instance, that when I was in the military, if you couldn't shoot it, run faster than it, drink more beer than it, it didn't exist. Now, how much of my belief system's changed since I left the military? So we're all works in progress, and I think people get impatient because they think they're the finished version.
Yeah.
When I went into the world, go on, Karen.
Well, I was on a course many years ago. It's called the Barbara Brennan School of Healing. She wrote a book, Barbara Brennan, called The Hands of Light. And it took me off to Austria for 4 years. I didn't do the term, actually. I think I did 2.5 to Austria, and we spent 5 weeks of the year over there, and then we did our work when we came home. I learned a lot, not everything that they wanted to teach me, but I learned by just going through the school. And she made a comment which I didn't like, but it's true. She said, you learn by relationship. And to me, that is fundamental. That's how we learn. That's how we ascend, how we progress, how we learn about ourselves. Because when you're in a relationship, things happen, and it doesn't have to be, you know, physical, sexual, or marriage. It can be the relationship with the barrister, with the taxi driver. It can be whatever. And that's how we get triggered, and that's how I think we deal with things, and that's how we evolve, if we can evolve. Because my next question, I think I've already said it before, so the winds are just coming here. I think we're getting another.
Yeah, it looks like you're having
storm.
a bit of
It's lovely. Yeah, the rains are coming. My hair's going to come up here in a minute.
Yeah. It certainly won't if there's any lightning.
Fizzy kizzy.
Frizzy kizzy, dead frizzy kizzy. So do you think, I know you have an amazing program that you help people, which has started from your working with the veterans. However, how else can people evolve and learn that they've got a shadow and work with it? I mean, they've obviously got to want to do the work first of all, but how else? What can we do to help, especially the freedom movement, where we all think, oh, we're free, we know what's going on in the world, we're okay. But to be honest, I think most of them are the worst because they haven't done that inner work. What can we do to help them?
I think the first stage of it, you know, people talk a lot about mindfulness, don't they? Where you become the observer of yourself. And for me, that's where it started for me. Observing yourself, recognizing when you get triggered, who you are in different spaces, what impacts on you, what doesn't impact on you, and spending time to reflect. We don't, as a society, as a human race, you know, many of us don't actually spend time to reflect, to actually get some of the awarenesses about self and others through reflection. And of course, mindfulness can show us a lot of things about ourselves, and we can learn a lot of things about ourselves, which can be great in itself because it can change perspectives, give us some insights. But of course, we still hold those images. You know, we can get the awareness, but mindfulness is really, for me, the first start of the evolutionary journey. Getting that self-awareness and stepping out of victimhood. You know, when I went through my Kundalini awakening, and I couldn't make sense of what was happening. I just knew my whole world had been turned upside down, and I was feeling things in my body that I'd never felt before, seeing things that I'd never seen before. So I went to Kundalini yoga thinking that I could find the answer outside of myself. And I went there and realized that actually I couldn't find any answers outside of myself. I had to find them within myself. And the first part of that, I remember, you know, at the end of doing one of the Kriyas, we talk, and I started sharing some of my journey, which I generally kept private. You know, I would share some of it with people I know, but it was never something that I would really share with anybody on a daily basis. But it was in here. It was a story. It was that rhetoric in my mind, that record that was going round and round all of the time. And the lady, as harsh as it was, the teacher at the time, she said to me, "You're a victim, Vicky." And that cut me to the core. I thought, I've never been a victim. I've never seen myself as a victim. And of course, she probably went about it in a much more direct way.
It's a suggestion as well.
Yeah, and it is a suggestion as well.
Yeah.
But it was a truth. I was a victim. Now, it might not have been something that I put out to the world, but I definitely was a victim in my mind. Things had been done to me. And, you know, the journey of evolution is learning to come from being the victim to being the student, to becoming the victor. And of course, that starts with ownership. Now, things happen to us, right? And some of those things aren't very nice. And by no means am I saying by taking ownership that we should dismiss what other people do, because they equally should take ownership. And it doesn't equal it doesn't make excuses for what they've happened. But if we want to carve a path of happiness, then that has to come from within inside us. And that's letting go of our triggers. That's resolving the triggers. You know, that's when we can start to let go of the victim and actually become the student, because a powerful thinker, powerful person, is a great permission, isn't it? To say, something happened to me in the early stage of my life, and then our mind is bound to it for the rest of our lives, and those stories run in our minds. But the only thing that binds us to that story, what we tell in ourselves and the things that we do, is the energy that binds us to it. And the energies are the emotions.
And the fact that no one's ever challenged it.
Yeah.
So from my perspective,
yeah,
the greatest thing you can do is to learn the art of questions. And find a buddy, someone that learns the art of questions, to challenge your story, to challenge your language, to challenge your perspective, because it's just a perspective if it's not measured. So what can you do to make yourself more powerful? Learn questions. When I introduced performance coaching to the British Army, it worked for about 60% of people. It didn't work for the 40%. But if you learn the art of questions on a level that you can learn them, our conversations with each other are quite unique in some ways as a couple, because we challenge each other's stories with questions. The whole purpose of a question is to raise awareness. It's to get you out of your frame. If you understand questions on a finer level, you'll start to see the glue that holds a problem together. And so learning questions, I would say, is one of the best things you can do. You know, when we created the Happiness Accelerator coaching program, that was to put people on the first rung. But there are some pretty unique questioning models. And one of the reasons I created one of the models was for that reason. Because if you keep running your story and no one ever gets you to realize your story, to understand it on a level, then you're not even in a position to change it. Now, the ultimate thing is, it still has to be changed. And I've got to be honest with you, I haven't seen many things that are that comprehensive at the level of emotional change.
I think it's really important to share as well that that Mick's perspective, because it's not it comes from an experience. So, you know, he was a qualified performance coach in the military. He is a master, he's a trainer of hypnotherapy, so he understands hypnotherapy. He's taught hypnotherapy. He's also a master practitioner of NLP.
Trainer.
Yeah, he's a trainer. You've done EMDR, EFT,
EMDR, IEMT, timeline therapy. So I did a number.
You analysed them,
and of course,
didn't you?
I analysed them as well, Karen. Now, I'm not saying that I'm anything special. I'm just saying that if you don't ever have your story challenged by somebody objectively on the outside, you're in danger of becoming a legend in your own mind on the inside. And when you start throwing accusations out there and you start projecting yourself, you can obviously see that's a person that's never actually owned an element of their own life. So there's a golden nugget in having your story challenged through questions. And I see that as the first and most fundamental step. So
Yes,
I would now, go on.
We'll go. Well, no, I think that's key. I think it's key because the amount of courses that I've been through, you know, in my 61 years being on this planet. And the first one, when you're younger, you know, you're feeling a little bit self-conscious when you're engaging with people you don't know, and you have to being told to look in their eyes or hug them or whatever, and then sit there and tell your story. Although it's not about the story, it is about the emotions that are created from the story, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what you've said, I think, is having, I don't know, is it courage? I think it must take guts and courage actually to speak out and be prepared to tell your story, because so many people don't. They want to remain the victim. You know, they're happier being the victim, and that's interesting.
And I think that's sometimes because they don't know any different. I mean, you know,
no, you wouldn't.
People wouldn't know any different until they learn something new. They wouldn't even know that that's where they are. They wouldn't know who they are to somebody else. They wouldn't know the behaviors they do. Sometimes you do. When you become the observer and you start analyzing and observing yourself, you become very, very well aware. And so when Mick talks about questions, I think it's really important that we talk about specific questions. They're semantic questions. And the only time we ever ask the question why on our programs is to assess somebody's motivation for change, because the why question, people can make up any reason for why.
Yeah, why me?
When you ask a what or a how question, that takes the mind in a different direction. And of course, when people are triggered, it's totally natural for people to think that it's the person in front of them or the situation that's causing it. And if we take COVID, for example, because everyone's aware of COVID, right? Everyone knows COVID happened. So we demonstrated that, you know, COVID is the map. This is what people are consciously aware of. But actually, the territory, the root of any triggers that somebody might have had during that time is actually somewhere else. And when we did a day with Sina, didn't we?
Yeah, we did, yeah.
And we demonstrated with a number of people in the room how COVID was the map for something else that they're holding. And so the question we asked for a number of people was, how was COVID a problem for you? It's not why was COVID a problem for you. How was COVID a problem for you? And one person said, well, it was all the indoctrination, wasn't it? And I'm like, well, that might be for them, right? But not necessarily for me.
And that's their hot word.
And that's their hot word.
That's where their problem is.
That's where their problem is.
Because they'll have been indoctrinated before.
So what emotion comes with indoctrination? Well, fear. I said, when else have you felt fear around indoctrination? Well, that's connected to my mum with religion. So now we've heard indoctrination, mum, religion. They're three layers of life that will hold anger, sadness, fear, guilt, hurt, anxiety around it. So one person's territory around COVID was indoctrination and religion connected to their mother. The next person we asked was, how was COVID a problem for you? Well, it was the manipulation. And so they had an emotion of, where there's one, there's generally all, but there's generally one that's predominant. Well, angry. So when else have you felt anger around manipulation? The territory was their father. Somebody else, it was around the loss of people, and he had lost lots of friends. So you can see that this one sort of universal thing that comes onto the planet is a panacea for everybody's trauma, life experiences, whatever you want to believe.
Yeah.
And if we were all clever and we actually said, actually, this is a gift from the universe that's put onto the planet to actually say it's time to actually address how we are contributing to what is
your own
going on in the
territory,
world,
yeah.
our own territory. But of course, people think it's the person, and so we might say, well, who's that? Who does that person remind you of? And then suddenly memories come in, and that then takes it to the source of it.
But you've got to have the art of questions to do that, and you have to know as well that certain questions will chunk through the surface structure of language to get to the deep structure. But a lot of people don't know how to do that. And by the way, Karen, if anybody wants that resource, I'm more than happy to share it. I've got a full video
I'll add
resource.
it. Yeah, I'll put it in the description.
Got a full video resource on the art of questions to show you that when we tell a story, it's full of imagination.
Yeah.
And how do we get rid of the imagination? Through the art of questions.
Yeah. Because I think also, you know, we know, have brought up COVID and where we are now with the topsy-turvy world in which we're living. I think most people have some idea that it's gone a bit bonkers. When I'm over here, I meet so many people from all parts of the world, escaping from Europe because of what's happening, particularly in the Western part of the world. But when one set up initiatives like you did with Guardians, and when I did with the Freedom Network, I'm not saying we were leaders, but we were creating initiatives because, okay, I have to always be aware of when you're saying leaders and gurus and teachers. Obviously, we can teach people, but it goes back to the inner work. And, you know, there's nobody that's going to get us out of this, even whether it's Trump, like him or hate him, or Elon Musk, like him or hate him, or any of them. We've got to do the work ourselves. And I think that's what is, we have to pay attention to this. That's why I really wanted to do this video, because people's saying, how do we get out of it? Especially if you are in this freedom movement, you get out of it by doing that inner work. And as I was trying to say, and I was digressing, when we set up these initiatives, because we are seen as a leader, we are our back is stabbed quite a lot by people in the movement, you know, that want the world to be at a better place, and they're aware of what's going on. But we're accused of certain things, and being human, because I still am. I haven't, you know, I'm still 100% human, as you guys are.
We're still here.
We're still here. We're still here. But we do get emotions, and we're triggered, and it is how we deal with it, isn't it? Because I know when I was stabbed in the back by people that I thought my best buddies, and they were making all these accusations about she takes the money, or she's, well, I don't know half of them, but I know a lot of stuff went on, and it's very painful. But then I think, I could go in the corner and go away. But actually, it spurred me on to do more. And I'm thinking, well, that's their issue. If they think that's up to them. That's their problem. I've got a job to do, and I'm going to go on and do it.
The thing is, Karen, it takes effort to raise your game, right? It takes effort to raise your game, and I think she's frozen.
With her tongue hanging out.
She's got her tongue hanging out, so she's frozen. Yeah, we'll wait for that to come back. I think it's still recording, so
I don't know if she's going to come back, or whether we're going to have
you might be right.
log off and go again.